Two pilots made some of the worst possible mistakes you can make, and they crashed when they were trying to land, killing everyone on board the plane. However, the most shocking part of the story is who was flying the plane. And the truth is that this is probably one of the most frustrating debriefs I've ever done on this channel, especially when you find out how it all happened. Let's get started. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Our story begins on July 26, 2021, when two pilots were hired to fly 4 passengers and 2 dogs from the Coeur Airport in Idaho to the Truckee Airport in California, just north of Lake Tahoe. It's not clear what the purpose of the trip was, but according to the investigation, it was a Part 91 flight, meaning the passengers didn't have to pay for the trip. Now, regardless of how the flight was characterized, 6 people are dead, and we need to focus on the mistakes that got them all killed. The 4 passengers included Ryan and Christine, who were the founders of a real estate agency called Hideaway Properties, and they had also recently helped launch a startup aviation charter company that was conducting the flight. Basically, Ryan was providing the money to grow the fleet of aircraft for the company, and his whole idea was he was going to offset the cost of the airplanes by flying his real estate clients to their second homes to make some money. Also sitting in the back was Kevin, who was 34 years old and an associate with Hideaway and good friends with Ryan and Christine. Ken was also on board, who was 62 years old, and he was the co-founder of Rainier Capital, a very successful commercial real estate investment firm. The aircraft they were flying in was a 2007 Bombardier Challenger 605. This is a swept-wing twin-engine aircraft designed for 2 pilots, and it can carry up to 19 passengers. And according to the investigation, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft at the time of the crash. That means the NTSB needed to focus on the pilots. And because the aircraft was equipped with a flight data recorder and a cockpit voice recorder, they were able to figure out what happened during the flight, and that would turn out to be the most shocking part of this entire story. Alberto was 43 years old, and he was the captain for the flight, sitting in the left seat, and he was the pilot flying the aircraft. He obtained his private pilot certificate in February of 1998, his multi-engine rating in 2010, and his airline transport pilot certificate in 2012, and he had been flying for over 23 years when the tragedy took place. During that time, Alberto accumulated over 5,600 hours of total flight time, including over 2,300 hours on a Challenger 601, but he only had about 230 hours flying the Challenger 605 when they crashed. The reason this is important is because there are some big differences between these two aircraft. This is what the inside of a 601 looks like with its small primary flight displays and older avionics, and as far as I know, the 601 is pretty much considered obsolete these days. If you compare that to the inside of a 605, you can see there's a big difference as the 605 has a more advanced cabin with larger windows, improved avionics, and it's also a much more capable aircraft. In fact, the 605 has a completely different type rating compared to the 601, so even though Alberto had a lot of experience on the 601, he was relatively new to the 605. The company that hired him to conduct the flight had paid for him to go through recurrent training on the 605, and that took place about 10 days prior to the tragedy. According to his instructors, he had good situational awareness, but he would rush abnormal checklists and needed to slow down and read the checklist requirements. The other thing you need to know about Alberto is that when he was hired to conduct the flight, the company couldn't make him an employee because he wasn't a US citizen and there was a problem with his visa. So instead, they hired him as an independent contractor, so that way they wouldn't lose the money they had invested in him having paid for his training. However, the truth is that if they had looked a little bit closer, they would have learned that Alberto only had a visitor's visa, which meant he wasn't authorized to operate any flights for compensation in the US, and that means he never should have been on the flight to begin with. But now that you understand a little more about Alberto, we need to look at the pilot that was sitting next to him. Brett was 56 years old, and he was the first officer sitting in the right seat, and his role was pilot monitoring during the flight. That meant his job was to support the captain, talk on the radios, and run the checklist, amongst other things. Brett was also an independent contractor and not an employee of the company that arranged the flight. He obtained his private pilot license in March of 1988 and became a flight instructor about a year later. Eventually, he got involved in aerobatic flying, and in 1993, he came in second place in the sportsman category at the U.S. National Aerobatic Championships. He earned his airline transport pilot certificate in April of 1999, and at the time of the crash, he had been flying for over 33 years and had over 14,000 total hours, including over 12,000 hours as pilot in command, with about 4,500 hours in the Challenger series aircraft. According to the investigation, Brett went through recurrent training for the Challenger 605 in June, about 1 month prior to the crash, which he paid for himself out of his own pocket, and his instructors had nothing but nice things to say about him. Afterwards, Brett flew multiple trips on the Challenger 605 in the weeks leading up to the crash, operating as both pilot in command as well as second in command, and there wasn't anything abnormal about his behavior according to those that flew with him. That being said, the only problem that was a big threat to this flight was the fact that you had a very highly experienced pilot in the right seat and an inexperienced pilot in the left seat acting as the pilot in command. Now, this can sometimes create a very weird dynamic that can be a threat to effective crew resource management because you can find yourself in a situation where the first officer might have to tell the captain what to do, which is just an awkward situation. It's also a big deal on a flight like this because we're talking about two contract pilots that went through different training programs and they weren't operating off of a common set of standards for the company they were flying for. Not only that, but to make matters worse, the two pilots had never even met before until the day of the crash. Alberto showed up at the airport around 10:15 in the morning, and Brett didn't show up until about an hour later, around 11:20, which was the same time the passengers showed up. So there wasn't any time to get to know each other or talk about how they planned to conduct the flight. Instead, the aircraft door closed about 10 minutes after Brett arrived, and they taxied out for takeoff. When it comes to the cockpit voice recorder, the NTSB summarized the dialogue for the ground operations, but if they had provided the full transcript, we'd have a much better understanding of how well these two pilots were working together. Instead, the summary says things like, the first officer asked if he should run the checklist, the first officer told Tower they could depart VFR and get their clearance in the air, and the first officer told ground they would be ready to go at the end of the taxiway. Now, even though it's Brett's job to talk on the radio, there's no mention of Alberto directing any of this. A great example of this is right after they got airborne, Alberto called for the flaps up, the heading mode, and flight level change, but he didn't call for the after takeoff checklist. And instead, Brett had to ask if he should run the checklist. A few minutes later, without prompting from Alberto, Brett ran the climb checklist, and there's still no mention of Alberto directing this or saying anything about it. Now, I realize this might seem like a minor detail, but it's very important because this is a trend that's going to continue throughout the entire flight, and it gives you a sense that Alberto was behind the aircraft or perhaps not ready to be pilot in command. And also that Brett was maybe leaning forward a little too much, acting like he was in charge of the flight. Once they reached their cruising altitude, Brett took over the controls so Alberto could go back and check on the passengers. However, there was no clear indication of when he returned to the flight deck, which meant there was nothing on the recording to reflect that the two pilots had a positive transfer of control of the aircraft. The reason this is so important is because if you don't know who's flying the aircraft, then that means no one is flying it, or worse, both pilots are trying to fly at the same time, which can be extremely dangerous, especially if it happens during a critical phase of flight. Either way, Alberto would be the one flying the plane for the rest of the flight, and when they were about an hour away from landing, they started getting ready for the approach, and that's when things started to go wrong. Alberto started his approach briefing by saying that they would program the GPS for runway 11 because the winds were calm, but then Brett immediately asked him if he wanted to fly the approach or just stay visual. Keep in mind that even if you have perfect weather, there's nothing wrong with flying a visual approach and using something like the ILS or GPS to back you up. However, in this case, Alberto said the visibility wasn't good, but then Brett immediately questioned him about that, and he went on to say, "Continue with your briefing. I'm sorry, I thought it was beautiful," referring to the visibility. Alberto had to explain to him that it was marginal VFR conditions, and now you're starting to see how these two pilots aren't getting along with each other. However, pay attention to what happens next because this is really where we start to see the crew coordination break down. That's because instead of making a decision as the pilot in command, Alberto started deferring to Brett, saying, "So if you agree, we're going to do the RNAV approach for runway 11 at Truckee." Brett asked if that was programmed already in the FMS, and Alberto said no. Then over the next 70 seconds, Alberto had to ask Brett 3 more times if he agreed with the plan before Brett finally said okay. As they got closer to the airport, someone tuned the radio to get the weather at Truckee, which said the visibility was 7 miles, but the actual visibility may be different than what is shown on the weather observation due to heavy smoke. The reason why there was so much smoke was because of some wildfires in the area, but it's not clear if both pilots heard this part of the transmission or if they were even paying attention to it because neither of them said anything about it. Moments later, Alberto called for the descent checklist, but Brett said, "Are you going to be on the headphones or are you just going to whisper?" This was probably because Alberto didn't have his headset on and Brett was having a hard time hearing him, but the reason I wanted to highlight this is because it's just one more example of the breakdown in crew communication, and you can almost sense the conflict building between the two pilots. I mean, even when Alberto asked for the checklist a second time and said please, instead of doing it, Brett had to question whether Alberto had the ATIS, which didn't make a lot of sense because then Brett would go on to say he was going to get the ATIS, and it's almost like he was trying to find something wrong with everything that Alberto did so that way he could call him out and make him look bad. This time we know for certain that Brett tuned the radio and he heard the update that the actual visibility at Truckee may be different due to heavy smoke in the area. However, instead of relaying that information to Alberto, he told him it was clear skies with 7 miles visibility. In fact, 30 seconds later, Alberto asked him again about the weather, and Brett reiterated that it was VFR with 7 miles visibility. When they started their initial descent from cruising altitude, they were cleared direct to a launch for the GPS approach to runway 11, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. But about 3 minutes later, when they checked in with the next controller, they were told to expect the RNAV approach to runway 20. Brett replied saying they were expecting the GPS runway 20, essentially agreeing with the controller. But what he really meant to say is they were expecting the GPS to runway 11, so the controller didn't respond to them. Now, in my opinion, this is where Alberto, as the pilot in command, should have told Brett, call him back and see if there's any chance we can get the GPS approach to runway 11, because that's what they had already briefed and were set up for. Instead, Alberto at least realized that runway 20 was too short because it's only about 4,600 feet long, and he told Brett they needed to circle to land on runway 11, which is about 7,000 feet long. However, instead of trusting Alberto, Brett questioned him about the landing distance, and Alberto had to explain they needed 5,000 feet per the book. That being said, there were two big problems with Alberto's plan to fly the approach to runway 20 and circle to land on runway 11. First of all, circling approaches can be very challenging to fly because pilots don't do them very often, and they're even more difficult in a situation like this with limited visibility. That's why it's so important to take the time to brief and understand how to fly the approach. In fact, I've talked about this on another video I made recently where an airline captain made several arrogant mistakes during a circling approach and he got 152 people killed. And I'll put a link for that at the end of this video if you want to watch it and find out more. For now, the second big problem with this circling approach was that the Challenger 605 was certified for Category C straight-in approach minimums, meaning a speed of 121 knots but less than 141 knots. But the thing is, when you fly a circling approach, you usually fly it faster than your straight-in approach speed because you need more airspeed for maneuvering during the circling portion of the approach. That's why it's recommended to fly the circling approach at one category higher, which would be Category D. Now the problem with that is if you look at the approach plate, there aren't any Category D minimums for this approach, so this is going to be a huge threat that they needed to talk about. That's why the best option would have been to ask for the straight-in approach to runway 11. But instead of doing that, Brett decided to actually agree this time with Alberto, and he told the controller they could fly the approach to runway 20, but they needed to circle to land on 11 so they could have the longer runway. The controller agreed with their plan, but because of delays getting into the airfield, he cleared them direct to the Alva intersection and told them to hold north and to expect further clearance in about 25 minutes. Alberto didn't know how to program that into the FMS, so Brett tried to tell him to go direct to Alva for now, and then he just took over the aircraft from Alberto, saying that he was starting the turn for him. So now you've got two pilots trying to fly the aircraft at the same time without a positive transfer of aircraft control. Eventually, Brett also took control of the FMS and he input the holding pattern, but then he told Alberto to finish building the approach, which I thought was a terrible idea because it's just making them fall further behind the aircraft. Once you start that descent from your cruising altitude, typically it's just easier to let the pilot monitoring handle all of the FMS changes while the pilot flying can focus on the approach. However, my guess is that Brett probably assumed they had at least 25 minutes to get everything in order, so they were completely unprepared when they were cleared for the approach about 4 minutes later. Keep in mind that they were still too high, they hadn't finished setting up the approach, and more importantly, they hadn't briefed how they were going to fly it. When they were cleared for the approach, Brett initially questioned whether they would be able to get down to 12,000 feet, but then he said they had plenty of time. Tragically, Brett had no idea they only had about 6 minutes left to live. Before I tell you what happened next, let me just say that there were several hundred pages of data involved in this debrief, and it wasn't possible to cover everything in this video. That's why I tried to pick out the most relevant parts that help us understand what happened, but bear with me because there's a lot of stuff that we need to talk about, especially the conversation that happened in the cockpit. When they started the approach, they were doing about 300 knots ground speed, and even though earlier Brett said they had plenty of time, now he was telling Alberto they needed to get the aircraft slowed down, and he asked him if he wanted to do a right 360. That would have been a great opportunity for them to take a moment to get everything in order and lose some altitude because they were at 15,000 feet, which was about 3,000 feet high on the approach. Instead, Alberto said, "No, I can do it." And then he said, "Below 250, give me flaps 20, please." And Brett corrected him saying, "Below 250? How about below 230? Once again, pointing out another mistake, and he also reminded Alberto that he needed to start slowing the aircraft down. About a minute later, Alberto asked Brett to lower the landing gear, but instead of just doing it, Brett felt the need to correct him again, saying, "How about gear down, flaps 30 before a landing checklist?" And Alberto replied, "Gear down, please." As they continued the approach, they were having a tough time seeing the airfield because of all the smoke from the wildfires, so Brett was only able to see the ground intermittently, and then there was some confusion because Alberto called for flaps 30, not realizing that Brett had already lowered the flaps. To make matters worse, Alberto wasn't sure which way they were supposed to turn for the circling approach, and Brett had to remind him to make a right-hand turn to get to the left downwind, and they were only about 5 miles from the runway. A few seconds later, Brett asked if Alberto was ready for full flaps, and after he lowered them, he finally saw the airport and told Alberto to start a right-hand turn 90 degrees. That right turn should have taken them to a heading of at least 290 degrees in order to parallel the runway on the downwind. But for some reason, Brett told Alberto to roll out almost as soon as he started the turn, and they stopped on a heading of 233 degrees, or roughly 55 degrees shy of the heading they needed to fly. That's probably because Brett wanted to keep the runway in sight since Alberto wasn't seeing it yet, and if they kept that right turn going, then Brett was going to lose sight of the airfield. But as you can see, this meant they were angling towards the runway and reducing the amount of separation they needed to safely fly the pattern. Brett told Alberto to turn the autopilot off, and then he said he was going to get their speed under control, and the investigation determined that at this point the spoilers were extended. These are speed brakes that help slow the aircraft down, but Brett never specifically said he was extending the spoilers, and I honestly think Alberto didn't realize what happened because that was about the same time that he finally saw the runway. And if you haven't noticed already, Brett is practically flying the aircraft for Alberto, and the most shocking part of all of this is when Brett said, "Patience, patience, patience. You got all the time in the world. We don't want to be on the news. Auto throttles have it. You are looking very good, my friend. Nice and relaxed. Bring that turn around." Unfortunately, they weren't looking good, and they didn't have all the time in the world. In fact, they had less than 60 seconds to live, and this was an extremely unstable and dangerous approach. As they made the turn towards final, they were high and fast, and Alberto was so far behind the aircraft that he was just doing whatever Brett told him to do. At some point, he turned off the auto throttles, and when Brett recognized it, he asked for control of the aircraft, but Alberto ignored him, and someone decreased the engine power setting. They started to overshoot final, and Brett said they were going to go through it and come back, referring to the final approach course. However, at that point, they were about 0.8 miles from the end of the runway and still pointed 50 degrees to the right of the runway heading. So there's absolutely no reason they should have tried to continue the approach, and they should have immediately gone around. Instead, they increased the bank angle and got a sink rate warning, and the stick shaker activated, warning them that they were about to stall. Alberto yelled out, "What are you doing?" implying that Brett was doing something with the aircraft controls. It was later determined that when this happened, the throttles were advanced and the airspeed bug was moved to 138 knots, reflecting the possibility that at least one of the pilots might have intended to abandon the approach and execute a go-around, but it wasn't possible to determine who made those inputs, and neither one of them called for the go-around. Keep in mind, the entire time, Brett was the one saying they could make it work, even as they were overshooting final, so I think it's possible that Alberto was the one that increased the engine power to go around, while Brett was trying to take over the controls to prove that he could land the airplane, even if Alberto couldn't. Either way, this was extremely dangerous because both pilots were fighting each other over the controls, which is the worst mistake you could probably ever make when flying an aircraft. 1 second later, Brett said, "No, no, no." And then Alberto exclaimed again, "What are you doing?" They got a pull-up warning, and Brett said, "Let me have the airplane, let me have the airplane." The stick shaker activated again, and Brett asked for the airplane one more time before they exceeded the critical angle of attack and stalled, crashing in the woods on the edge of a golf course, killing everyone on board instantly. The investigation determined that the reason why they stalled and crashed was because when Brett extended the spoilers to get their airspeed under control, he never retracted them. The aircraft flight manual warns pilots that using spoilers below 300 feet is prohibited, and also you shouldn't use spoilers if you're slower than your approach speed plus 10 knots. Because they left the spoilers extended, it reduced their stall margin, and the stick shaker activated at 130 knots and a 36-degree bank turn. And the truth is that if the spoilers had been stowed, they wouldn't have stalled until they reached at least 50 degrees of bank. But I'd argue that even if they avoided the stall, there was no guarantee that they would have been able to land the aircraft, especially with both pilots fighting over the controls. The NTSB ultimately blamed both pilots for what happened. And I'll just add that in my opinion, Alberto was the pilot in command, so it was his responsibility to ensure the safe operation of the aircraft, and he failed to do that by not taking charge during the flight. However, Brett had countless opportunities to help him out, but instead he acted like he was giving Alberto a check ride, trying to point out all of his mistakes, which just made everything worse, and there was no reason this ever had to happen. I hope you're able to learn something from this video, and if you want to find out what happened when an airline captain made several arrogant mistakes and got 152 people killed, then be sure to check out this video on the screen, and I'll see you on the next debrief.